The rain wasn't just falling, it was clinging. A cold, miserable sheet of gray that blurred the world outside the windshield of his 10-year-old sedan. Kieran stared at the letter in his hands, the paper already softening in the damp air of the car. The corporate letterhead was crisp, the signature at the bottom brutally indifferent. Effective immediately. 2 words to dismantle a decade of loyalty. He had given them his best years, the ones after his wife passed, the ones where work was the only thing that felt solid under his feet. And now, it was gone. Replaced by a severance package that felt more like an insult than a safety net. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a sharp, insistent vibration against the worn fabric. He didn't need to look. He knew who it was. Simone. He'd been meaning to call her to deliver the bad news himself, but the words were stuck somewhere in his throat, thick with failure. The phone buzzed again. He finally picked it up, expecting to hear her voice, but it was just a text, a wall of text. He scanned the words, his heart sinking with each line. Can't do this anymore, Kieran. Need someone with ambition, with a future. This restructuring thing at your company, I heard rumors. It's for the best. There was no question, no conversation, just a verdict. She had left him. On the very day he had lost everything. He let the phone drop back onto the seat. The engine was off. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof and the frantic, useless beat of his own wipers against the glass. He felt hollowed out, a building gutted by fire, with only the fragile frame left standing. He had no job. He had no partner. He had nothing. He rested his forehead against the cold steering wheel, the plastic pressing into his skin. A single thought cut through the static in his head. Amira, his daughter. He had to go home. He had to pick her up from daycare. He had to smile and pretend the world hadn't just cracked open beneath his feet. His life had just been shattered into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. He had no idea it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Days passed. The initial shock hardened into a grim, quiet routine. Kieran woke up before the sun, not to beat traffic to the office, but to scan job listings that all seemed to require degrees he didn't have, or experience in fields he didn't know. He was Kieran, a black man in his early 30s, whose strength was in his hands and his quiet reliability. He knew how to manage a warehouse floor, how to anticipate shipping delays, how to earn the respect of his team not through authority, but through shared work. Those skills didn't seem to translate well to a resume. His world had shrunk to the walls of his small 2-bedroom apartment, a place that was tidy but lived in, filled with the lingering scent of his late wife's favorite lavender cleaner and the vibrant chaos of his daughter's creations. Amira was the sun around which his broken world orbited. She was 6 years old, a tiny force of nature with bright, perceptive eyes and natural hair always styled in intricate braids with colorful beads, a skill he was still trying to master from YouTube tutorials. Her hair, a testament to his love and his clumsiness, often had 1 or 2 beads that were slightly out of place, a small imperfection that only made him love her more. She was a whirlwind of run-on sentences and questions that sliced through his carefully constructed adult defenses. "Daddy, why are you home for cartoons?" she'd ask that first week, her head cocked to the side, her beaded braids clicking softly. He'd managed a smile. "Just a little vacation, sweetie." She had narrowed her eyes, her gaze far too wise for a 6-year-old. "You don't look like you're on vacation. Your smile is sleepy." He was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had little to do with sleep. It was the weight of being the sole provider, the only parent, the one who had to hold it all together. On the mantelpiece, a photo of his wife, Maya, smiled out at him. Her eyes were just like Amira's, He spoke to the photo sometimes, in the quiet of the night. "I'm trying, Maya. I'm really trying." The apartment was filled with her memory, but warmed by Amira's presence. Her crayon drawings were taped to the refrigerator, a gallery of lopsided suns and stick figures with impossibly wide smiles. One drawing showed a tall man, a little girl, and a woman with wings. That was Mama, who is an angel now, Amira had explained, her small finger tracing the crayon wings with reverence. He showed his love through action. He made her pancakes, often slightly burnt around the edges, which she declared crispy and the best. He read her bedtime stories, doing all the voices until his throat was hoarse. He was a man of few words, but his love was a tangible thing, in the way he knelt to tie her shoes, the way he packed her lunch with a note he'd drawn himself, the way his calloused hands that had once directed forklifts and managed inventory, were now gentle enough to smooth the hair back from her forehead as she slept. He was a good father. It was the only job title that mattered, and the only one he was terrified of failing at. The weeks that followed were a blur of fruitless applications and dwindling savings. He took odd jobs, handyman work he found on a community app, anything to keep the lights on and food on the table. It was humbling work, but there was a simple dignity in it. Fixing a leaky faucet, assembling a bookshelf, patching a hole in a wall. These were problems he could solve. Unlike the gaping hole in his career, he never complained. He just put on his worn work boots, packed a small toolkit, and went wherever the app sent him. His quiet competence, his only currency. One evening, a request came through. An emergency. A burst pipe in a penthouse apartment downtown. The pay was good, too good to pass up. The only problem was the time. It was late, and his neighbor who usually watched Amira in a pinch was out of town. He looked at his sleeping daughter, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. He couldn't leave her, but he couldn't afford to turn down the job. With a heavy sigh, he made a decision. He gently woke her, wrapped her in her favorite butterfly blanket, and carried her out to the car. "We're going on a little adventure, sweetie," he whispered, hoping she wouldn't see the worry in his eyes. He hoped whoever lived in that penthouse would understand. Naima Sterling commanded boardrooms. Her world was one of glass and steel, of quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. She was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm, a position she had clawed her way to with relentless precision, and an intellect that could dismantle a flawed business proposal in under a minute. Her appearance was an extension of her control. Elegant suits tailored to perfection, minimal jewelry, and her natural hair styled in an elegant updo that conveyed power and grace. Her deep brown skin seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights of her office, a testament to a wellness routine that was as rigorously scheduled as her meetings. From the outside, she had everything. Her penthouse apartment overlooked the entire city, a panorama of glittering lights that should have felt triumphant, but instead felt isolating. The silence in her apartment was absolute. It was a sterile, perfectly curated space, decorated in shades of white and gray. There were no crayon drawings on the refrigerator. There were no scuff marks on the pristine hardwood floors. There were no slightly burnt pancakes. Naima ate perfectly portioned meals delivered from the city's finest restaurants, usually alone at her marble kitchen island, her laptop open beside her. She was brilliant, admired, even feared. But she was profoundly lonely. Her success had been built on a foundation of conditional love. Her parents had praised her achievements, not her spirit. A past engagement had ended when her fiancé admitted he was more in love with her ambition than with her. She had learned early to armor herself, to equate vulnerability with weakness. Her poise was her shield. That evening, her shield was cracking. A loud bang from the guest bathroom had been followed by the horrifying sound of rushing water. She, a woman who could navigate hostile corporate takeovers, stood frozen and utterly helpless as water poured from under the door, spreading across her immaculate floors. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, and did what she always did when faced with a problem she couldn't solve. She outsourced it. She found an emergency plumbing app, her mind racing through the potential water damage costs, the insurance claims, the disruption to her schedule. She didn't think about the person who would be coming. To her, they were a function, a service provider, a solution to a logistical nightmare. She paced her living room, the water seeping into the edges of an expensive rug, her carefully controlled world dissolving into chaos. When the buzzer rang, she took a deep breath, smoothed down her silk blouse, and composed her face into its usual mask of calm authority. She opened the door, ready to issue commands, but the man standing in her hallway was not what she expected. And he was not alone. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway, his brown skin glistening with rain. He wore a simple work jacket and worn boots, and his eyes, though tired, were clear and direct. But it was the small bundle in his arms that stopped her cold. A little girl, wrapped in a butterfly blanket, was fast asleep on his shoulder, her cheek pressed against his neck. The man's expression was apologetic. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice low and steady. "Kieran, from the app. I couldn't find a sitter this late. If it's a problem, I understand." Naima stared at him, then at the child. The sight was so incongruous in her sterile, silent building, a father and his daughter, a small, self-contained world of warmth and care standing on her doorstep. Her carefully prepared speech about the urgency of the situation vanished. All she could do was nod. "No," she heard herself say, her voice softer than she intended. It's okay. Please, come in." He moved with a quiet efficiency that was deeply calming. He gently laid the sleeping Amira on the far end of her long white sofa, tucking the butterfly blanket around her. He surveyed the water damage with a practiced eye, his presence immediately lowering the temperature of Naima's panic. "It's the supply line to the toilet," he said after a brief inspection. "I can shut off the main, but I'll need to replace the valve." He spoke in short, grounded sentences. There was no flattery, no acknowledgement of the obvious wealth surrounding him. He was just a man here to do a job. Naima, accustomed to people who fawned or bristled in her presence, found his simple professionalism disarming. She watched as he worked, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft as he handled his tools. He was methodical, focused. He didn't make small talk. The only sounds were the clinking of metal and the soft, steady breathing of the little girl on the couch. An hour later, the rushing water was replaced by a quiet drip as he finished the repair. The silence that returned to the apartment felt different now, less empty. He cleaned up meticulously, wiping the floor with a rag he'd brought, leaving the space cleaner than he'd found it. "All set," he said, standing up. "You shouldn't have any more trouble with it." He wrote up an invoice on a simple pad of paper. The amount was shockingly reasonable. Naima had been bracing herself for a massive emergency surcharge. "Is that all?" she asked, surprised. He nodded. "That's the job." She transferred the money from her phone, adding a generous tip. He looked at the notification and then back at her. "This is too much." "No, it's not," she insisted. "For the late hour and the inconvenience." She gestured vaguely towards the sleeping child. A small smile touched his lips for the first time. "She's never an inconvenience." As he spoke, Amira began to stir. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, her beaded braids slightly askew. She looked around the vast, unfamiliar room with wide, curious eyes, finally settling her gaze on Naima. She wasn't shy. She slid off the couch and padded over to Naima, her small bare feet silent on the floor. She held up a crumpled piece of paper she'd been clutching in her hand. "This is for you," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Naima took it. It was a crayon drawing. A bright yellow sun with a smiley face. "For letting me sleep on your comfy cloud," Amira explained, pointing to the white sofa. Naima stared at the simple, heartfelt gift. No one had given her a drawing since she was a child herself. It was a gesture of pure, unconditional kindness, offered without agenda or expectation. She felt a strange tightness in her chest, an emotion so unfamiliar she couldn't immediately name it. It was gratitude, but it was something more. She looked from the drawing to the little girl's earnest face, then to the father watching them with a gentle patience. And for the first time in years, in that pristine, silent apartment, Naima Sterling felt a crack appear in her armor. She felt a tear slide down her cheek before she even realized she was crying. Kieran saw the tear and immediately misinterpreted it. He thought she was upset, that he had overstepped by bringing his daughter. "We should go," he said quickly, moving to take Amira's hand. "I'm sorry we disturbed you." Naima shook her head, hastily wiping her cheek. "No," she said, her voice a little shaky. "It's not that. It's thank you." She looked at the drawing in her hand as if it were a precious artifact. Amira, ever perceptive, tilted her head. "Why are you crying like me when I miss Mommy?" The question, so innocent and yet so profound, hung in the air between them. It broke the scene open. Kieran froze, his hand hovering over his daughter's shoulder. Naima was speechless. The child had seen past the CEO, past the penthouse, and straight into the heart of her loneliness, comparing it to the most sacred grief in her own small life. Kieran knelt down. "Honey, the lady isn't sad like that. She's just surprised." He looked at Naima, his eyes full of a deep, empathetic understanding. He saw her not as a client, but as a person. "It's okay," he said softly, a gentle command that was also a reassurance. That night, Naima taped the drawing of the yellow sun to the stainless steel door of her refrigerator. It looked absurdly out of place, a splash of chaotic, childish color in her monochrome kitchen. But every time she saw it, she felt that same unfamiliar warmth. A few days later, she noticed a door in her study was squeaking. It wasn't really, but she told herself it was. She found Kieran's number in the app's history and sent him a message, requesting his services specifically. He arrived the next afternoon, this time without Amira, who was at daycare. The job took him less than 5 minutes. The silence that followed was awkward. Naima, a master of negotiation, found herself at a loss for words. "Would you like some tea?" she offered, surprising herself. He seemed surprised too, but he nodded. "I'd like that." She made him ginger tea, her movements stiff and unpracticed in her own kitchen. They sat at the huge marble island, the space between them feeling vast. She asked about his work. He told her about losing his corporate job, about picking up handyman gigs to make ends meet. He spoke without a trace of self-pity, stating the facts of his life with a quiet dignity that she found compelling. He asked her about her work. She gave him the polished, professional version, but his steady, non-judgmental gaze made the words feel hollow. He wasn't impressed by the titles or the numbers. He seemed to be listening for the person behind them. The next week, she needed a large, flat-packed shelving unit assembled, a task she could have easily paid a premium service to handle. Instead, she called Kieran. This time, he brought Amira. It was a Saturday. While he worked, his brow furrowed in concentration as he deciphered the cryptic instructions, Naima found herself sitting on the floor with Amira, a box of crayons between them. Amira chattered non-stop, a breathless stream of consciousness about her school, her favorite butterfly, and how her daddy was the best pancake maker in the world, even if they were a little crispy. Naima listened, captivated. She learned that Kieran had been a widower for 4 years, that Maya, his wife, had loved to garden, that he was trying to grow tomatoes on their small apartment balcony in a pot she had painted. Amira showed Naima a picture on her father's phone of a beautiful black woman with a radiant smile holding a tiny baby Amira. "That's my mama," she said proudly. "She's in the stars now, watching us." Naima felt that now familiar ache in her chest. This small family, living in a world of scarcity and loss, possessed an emotional richness that made her own life of abundance feel utterly impoverished. When the shelf was finally built, Amira proudly placed the first object on it, a small, framed photo of her mother. Then she turned to Naima. "You can put something on it too," she offered. Naima had nothing personal to add. Her apartment was filled with art and objects, but nothing that held a memory, nothing that felt like a piece of her soul. The realization landed with a quiet thud. The visits became a weekly ritual, built on the flimsiest of pretexts. A flickering light bulb she couldn't reach, a loose cabinet handle, a picture that needed hanging. Kieran must have known her excuses were thin, but he never said a word. He would come, fix the problem, and then stay for tea. And Amira would bridge the gap between their two worlds. She decided Naima needed a plant, and one day, she and Kieran arrived with a small, struggling orchid. "Daddy says you have good sun," she announced, placing it on the windowsill in Naima's office. Naima, who had never managed to keep a plant alive, found herself dutifully watering it, a small, living thing that depended on her. One rainy Saturday, Kieran was fixing a draft from a window when Amira tugged on Naima's sleeve. She held out her tiny wrist, which was adorned with a colorful friendship bracelet made of braided embroidery floss. "I made you one too," she said, holding up a matching bracelet. She had made it in Naima's corporate colors, a detail so thoughtful it made Naima's breath catch. Amira carefully tied it around Naima's wrist. It was a simple, childish gift, yet it felt like an initiation, an offering of belonging. Kieran finished his work and came over, a soft smile on his face as he watched the scene. "Amira," he said gently, "I think you've just given Ms. Sterling her first piece of jewelry that can't be insured." Naima laughed, a real, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet apartment. It felt rusty, like a piece of machinery that hadn't been used in years. Kieran's smile widened. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, the professional distance between them dissolved entirely. In its place was something warmer, something more fragile. That evening, a storm raged outside, trapping them in the penthouse. They ordered pizza, eating it out of the box while sitting on her expensive rug, a breach of decorum that would have horrified the Naima of a month ago. Amira fell asleep between them, her head resting on Naima's lap. The easy domestic intimacy of the moment was terrifying and exhilarating. They spoke in low voices, not wanting to wake the sleeping child. It was then that the carefully constructed walls between them finally crumbled. He told her about Maya, not just that she had died, but how she had lived. He spoke of her laughter, her passion for community organizing, the way she had made him feel seen and valued long before he had a respectable job title. After she was gone, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, I felt invisible. Like the only part of me that mattered was gone. Being Amira's dad, that's what saved me. His vulnerability was a gift. Naima felt compelled to offer one in return. She told him about her childhood, the constant pressure to be exceptional, the feeling that love was something to be earned through achievement. I've been in boardrooms where billions of dollars were on the table, she said, her gaze lost in the city lights beyond the window. I've felt the pressure, the adrenaline, but I've never felt this. She looked down at the sleeping child in her lap. I've never felt this level of peace. They sat in shared silence, the storm outside a distant rumble. It was a quiet, unhurried moment of shared wounds, of two lonely people finding a flicker of recognition in each other's eyes. He hadn't tried to fix her problem. He had simply sat with her in it. When the storm passed and it was time for them to leave, he gently lifted Amira into his arms. At the door, he paused. Naima, he said, using her first name for the first time. Thank you for letting us in. She simply nodded, the bracelet on her wrist a warm, colorful weight. She was no longer just a client, and he was no longer just the handyman. They were something else, something undefined and terrifyingly hopeful. The fragile bubble of their nascent connection was bound to burst. The world Naima inhabited did not make space for men like Kieran, except as service staff. The threat arrived in the form of a woman named Simone. She was a mid-level executive at a rival company, a woman whose ambition was as polished and sharp as her acrylic nails. She and Naima moved in the same circles of charity galas and industry conferences. They were rivals, but maintained a veneer of professional cordiality. One afternoon, Naima had asked Kieran to meet her in the lobby of her building to pick up a check for a local community garden he and Amira volunteered at, a project Naima had decided to fund through her company's philanthropic arm. As Kieran stood waiting, dressed in his usual clean but simple clothes, Simone swept into the lobby, her eyes widening in cruel recognition. "Kieran, what on earth are you doing here?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. He stiffened, his posture becoming guarded. "Hello, Simone. I'm meeting someone." Just then, Naima emerged from the elevator. Simone's perfectly made-up face shifted from surprise to malicious glee. "Naima, don't tell me he's who you're meeting." Naima's professional mask snapped into place. "Simone, yes, Kieran and I had a meeting." Simone let out a brittle laugh. "A meeting? Oh, that's rich. You do know who this is, don't you? He's a failed logistics manager. Got himself fired. I should know. I left him the day it happened. The man has absolutely nothing." The words were designed to humiliate, to strip Kieran of his dignity in front of this powerful woman. Naima looked at Kieran. His face was a stoic mask, but she could see the hurt in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He didn't defend himself. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, absorbing the blow with that quiet strength she had come to admire so much. Naima turned her cool gaze back to Simone. "Thank you for your input, Simone," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "But my meetings and my associates are none of your concern." She handed the envelope to Kieran, her fingers brushing his. "I'll see you Saturday," she said, a clear statement of loyalty. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Simone fuming in her wake. The encounter, however, planted a poisonous seed. Simone, petty and vindictive, began to whisper. The rumors spread through the corporate grapevine. Naima Sterling, the Ice Queen CEO, was involved with a broke, unemployed handyman. The pressure began to mount. A senior board member, a man who had been her father's contemporary, called her into his office for a friendly chat. He spoke of optics, of the company's image, of the need for a leader to maintain a certain standard in their personal life. "A man like that, Naima, it suggests poor judgment," he said, his words couched in paternalistic concern. The whispers became a liability. During a tense negotiation for a major acquisition, the rival CEO made a snide remark, just loud enough for the room to hear. "If Ms. Sterling's judgment in her personal life is any indication, perhaps we should reconsider this deal." Naima felt the walls closing in. The world she had fought so hard to conquer was now threatening to reject her, all because she had dared to connect with someone outside its narrow, class-bound confines. The joy and warmth she had found with Kieran and Amira began to be overshadowed by anxiety. She started canceling their appointments, offering vague excuses about work. The distance between them grew, a painful silence stretching over the phone lines. She knew she was hurting him and hurting herself, but she didn't know how to reconcile her two worlds. She had to make a choice. The choice came at the company's annual gala, a glittering affair where the city's most powerful figures gathered. Naima was scheduled to give the keynote address, announcing a massive new initiative. The board member who had warned her was in the front row, watching her with a proprietary air. Simone was there too, preening at a table with Naima's competitors, a smug smile on her face. Naima stood at the podium, the stage lights hot on her face. Her prepared speech loaded onto the teleprompter. She looked out at the sea of faces, all of them looking at her with expectation. They saw the CEO, the powerhouse, the brand. They didn't see the woman who kept a child's drawing of a sun on her fridge. The woman who wore a cheap, colorful bracelet under the sleeve of her $1,000 dress. She began her speech, the familiar corporate language flowing easily. But the words felt like ash in her mouth. She talked about growth and synergy and market disruption. And then she saw him. Kieran wasn't supposed to be there. He was working the event as part of a catering crew, a side gig he'd taken for the night. He was in the back of the ballroom, dressed in a simple black uniform, clearing plates. He wasn't looking at her. He was just doing his job, his movements efficient and dignified. But she saw him. And in that moment, everything became clear. She saw the quiet nobility in the way he worked, the integrity that had nothing to do with a job title or a bank account. She saw the man who had shown her more kindness in a few weeks than she had received in a lifetime of achievement. She faltered, her speech trailing off. The room went quiet. She looked away from the teleprompter, her eyes finding his across the vast ballroom. This time, he looked up. Their eyes met. "You know," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, all pretense gone. "We talk a lot in this business about value, about assets. We measure it in stock points and market share." She took a breath. "But I've recently been reminded what real value is. It's not in a portfolio. It's in a person's character. It's in their kindness. It's in the way they show up for the people they love." She looked directly at the senior board member. "I've been advised recently to be mindful of appearances, to associate with the right kind of people." A murmur went through the crowd. "But the right people aren't the ones with the most money or the best titles. They're the ones who see you, the ones who make you feel safe enough to be yourself." She took off the expensive watch from her wrist and set it on the podium. She pushed up the sleeve of her dress, revealing the colorful bracelet Amira had made her. "This is the most valuable thing I own," she said. "It was given to me by a 6-year-old girl. Her father is in this room tonight. He's clearing your tables. He lost his job a few months ago, and according to some, he has nothing." Her gaze swept the room, finally landing on Simone, whose face had gone pale. "They are wrong. He has integrity. He has honor. He has a daughter who adores him. He has a heart bigger than this entire ballroom. That isn't nothing. That is everything." She turned back to the microphone. "The initiative I was meant to announce tonight, I'm still going to launch it, but not as CEO of this company. As of tonight, I am resigning. I'm going to be building something new, something that measures success not in profits, but in the number of lives we can make better." She looked to the back of the room one last time, her heart pounding. "Thank you." And with that, she walked off the stage, leaving a stunned and silent audience in her wake. She had just walked away from her entire life, and she had never felt so free. She didn't wait for the fallout. She walked through the stunned crowd, out of the ballroom, and straight to the service exit where she knew the catering staff would be. She found Kieran stacking dishes, his back to her. He had obviously heard everything. "Kieran," she said softly. He turned around slowly, his face unreadable. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. He didn't move. She didn't speak. The clatter of the kitchen behind them seemed to fade away. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally, his voice rough. "Yes," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. "I did." She took a step closer. "For months I've been trying to fit you and Amira into my world. I was wrong. I don't want that world anymore. I just want a life." He searched her face, his gaze intense, looking for any hint of doubt or regret. He found none. All he saw was the raw, vulnerable, courageous woman who had just dismantled her empire for a principle, for him. He finally closed the small distance between them. He reached out, and his calloused fingers gently touched the friendship bracelet on her wrist. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted, and the uncertainty felt like a gift. Build something, something real, with the right people. He nodded slowly, a dawning understanding in his eyes. He saw her. Not the CEO, not the powerhouse, just Naima, a woman who had chosen authenticity over applause. He drove her back to his apartment. It felt like the only real place in the city. The building was old, the hallway dimly lit, but as he unlocked his door, the warm light from inside spilled out like a promise. Amira, who had been with the neighbor, was already home and asleep in her room. The apartment was quiet. He made them both ginger tea, the familiar ritual grounding them after the seismic shock of the evening. They sat on his worn sofa, the same one where she had once seen a sleeping child, and felt the first crack in her armor. "My ex," he said into the quiet. She saw a job title, a salary. "When those things were gone, I was gone. You looked at me when I had nothing, and you saw me." "I saw everything that matters," she whispered. She stayed, not just for the night, but for the days and weeks that followed. She moved out of her sterile penthouse and into a small apartment nearby. Her resignation sent shockwaves through the business world, but she never looked back. She and Kieran together began to sketch out the plans for her new foundation, a nonprofit that would provide resources and mentorship for skilled workers displaced by corporate restructuring. His practical, logistical mind was the perfect complement to her visionary drive. They were a team, but more than that, they were becoming a family. One afternoon, Naima was sitting on the floor of Kieran's living room, helping Amira organize her art supplies. Amira was quiet for a long time, concentrating on a new drawing. Finally, she held it up for Naima to see. It was a picture of 3 stick figures standing in front of a small house with a big garden. One was a tall man with brown skin. One was a little black girl in a yellow dress, her hair in 2 puffs. And holding both of their hands was a woman with brown skin and natural hair, wearing a colorful bracelet. "It's our family," Amira said, her voice full of simple, innocent certainty. "Daddy, me, and you." She pointed to the empty space above the house. "And Mama is the star, watching." Naima's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She looked at Kieran, who was watching them from the doorway, his face alight with a love so profound it needed no words. He walked over and knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around them both. In that small, love-filled apartment, surrounded by crayon drawings and the scent of ginger tea, Naima finally understood. Home wasn't a place. It was this. It was them. Months later, the late afternoon sun spilled through the windows of a small office illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The office was modest, located in a historically black neighborhood buzzing with life. This was the headquarters of their new foundation. Naima, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, laughed as Kieran tried to untangle a string of fairy lights. Amira directed the operation from a nearby chair, issuing solemn instructions. They were decorating their new space, making it their own. The work was hard, the hours were long, but it was the most fulfilling work Naima had ever done. They were helping people, building something that mattered. That evening, they sat on the small balcony of Kieran's apartment, which was now overflowing with tomato plants and herbs, a tribute to Maya that Naima now helped to tend. Amira was asleep inside. The city glittered below them, but it no longer looked lonely to Naima. It looked full of possibility. Kieran took her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The corner office? The galas?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I miss the woman I thought I had to be sometimes, but I wouldn't trade this for anything." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Simone found out I was working at that gala. I heard she told people she couldn't believe you'd throw your life away for a man who had nothing." Naima smiled, a soft, radiant expression that lit up her whole face. "She never understood, did she?" she said. "She found out what you lost. She never bothered to find out what you had. What you've always had." He didn't have a fortune, or a title, or a fancy car, but he had a quiet strength that could weather any storm. He had a boundless capacity for love. He had a daughter who was a beacon of light. He had integrity, etched into every line on his tired, handsome face. He was the richest man she had ever known. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a single, perfectly ripe tomato from their balcony garden. He placed it in her palm. "Naima Sterling," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will you help me grow our garden? For good?" It wasn't a question about plants. It was a question about a life, a future, a family. She closed her hand around the warm tomato, its simple, earthy weight feeling more precious than any diamond. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay. Forever." The narrator's voice, warm and reflective, would say, "Love is not something you find in the grand gestures, but in the quiet moments. It is not measured by what is gained, but by what one is willing to let go of." For Kieran, losing everything was the only way to make room for what truly mattered. And for Naima, walking away from a kingdom was the only way to finally come home. Family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you have the courage to choose, the one that chooses you back and sees you finally and completely for everything you are.